wake all of you up this morning and play for you the new Stevie Wonder song, What's the Fuss? We couldn't get all the stuff together, so I just have to commend it to you. So I want to, first of all, thank Arise and all of you for the work you're doing, and Mr. Anderson. I wonder what he's doing down in Atlanta when I saw him down there. So I have a PowerPoint this morning, and I stayed up too late last night messing with it and messed up some of the color. And I won't get through all of it, but what I do want to do, I'll highlight some things, and then I'll leave it with the organizers for your review. So I'm going to be talking today about structural racialization. I'm also going to be talking about implicit bias and race today. And now you may notice that I use the word structural, or the term structural racialization. First of all, I want to clarify why I use that term. So let me just have a show of hands. How do you know what the term racialization means, or the word racialization? Okay, so not many. That's good. I was hoping to use a term that only a few people had any understanding of, so it gave me a chance to explain it to you. In all seriousness, I actually do use the term structural racialization because in our society, when you use the word racism, and I'll be talking more about how we talk in a few minutes. When we use the word racism, as a friend of mine said, that's a conversation ending strategy in mixed company. The room gets quiet. Some people decide they're late for their appointment that they don't have. And then some people just get angry. And racism sort of connotes to most people in our society sort of intentional personal animus. Intentional personal animus. And so if you want to talk about systems, institutions, structures, you never get there because the person immediately starts, focusing on, as you say, someone hypothetically called the president a liar on national television, and the whole discussion becomes, is that person a racist? Meaning, does that person have personal racial animus toward the president? Not, is that a disrespectful term? Not as a term that has racialized meaning and racialized implications. So when we look at structures, we're talking about things that sometimes predictably produce racialized outcomes that disadvantage one group over another group, even if no one intended that. So we want to focus on what's actually happening, not simply what we intend. Now I should say, some people feel a little uncomfortable with the term racialization instead of racism. They feel that you're letting people off the hook. Well, two things I want to say about that, or three things really. Maybe we're letting them off the hook, but maybe we're putting them on the hook. Because I think what we really want in this society is change. And there's actually some very good literature that suggests that personal prejudice, especially personal racialized prejudice, is never just personal. That you can't have prejudice, and I'll say more about this in a little bit, unless you have a discourse about race, unless you created racial categories, unless you sorted people racially, and unless you create a racial meaning. And all that actually happens at the macro level. Then how we negotiate that becomes personal. But in a society, for example, that doesn't even have race, they're not going to have racial prejudice. So in a sense, there is even the notion that a person's feeling about race is completely private and personal or individual is actually not accurate. So one way of thinking about this is that we're really talking about race in action. We're talking about the way race works. And race is a process. It's a complicated process that most of us live, in some respects, and few of us really understand because it is so complicated. But in terms of understanding the racial process and race in action, we need to look at structural racialization and systems on one hand. We need to look at implicit bias in the mind science on the other hand. And then we need to look at power. We need to look at all three of those and how those three things interact. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about all three with some focus on structural racialization. So if we think about racial justice and the sites of racial justice, these are the sites: the explicit, the implicit, and structural systems of policies. And I think what's happened in our country is that we spend a lot of time on the explicit, almost no time on the implicit, and even less time on structures and systems. So we don't say, is the way we structure our school system producing racialized outcomes? Instead we say, no, the superintendent is not racist, the school board is not racist. We don't look at the actual structures and policies to see if they are producing predictable racialized outcomes. So I think we have to shift our focus. So I think what Anderson was right, is that it's a paradigm shift. You know, when the levees broke in New Orleans, I got calls from all over the country. It was actually a very interesting time because people were trying to make sense of what was going on. People were trying to make sense of the fact that on national television, most of the faces of people trapped on top of roofs were black. And for the first few days, if those of you who remember, the press kept telling us, first of all, this had nothing to do with race. You know, it reminded me of that famous American philosopher that some of you may have heard of, named Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor tells a story about his wife coming home unexpectedly and unannounced and opens the door and finds him in bed with another woman. And he says, before you say anything, let me just ask you, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? And the press was telling us, don't believe your lying eyes. This has nothing to do with race. And finally they said, well, maybe it has something to do with race, or maybe it's class, or maybe it's anything but race. We don't want it. We want to be, this is even before Obama, right? We want to be in a post-racial colorblind society. So don't believe your lying eyes. And then finally they said, well, maybe race has something to do with it. So I got calls from all over the country from reporters and television stations, radio stations, and the question they asked invariably is, do you think President Bush is a racist? And my response is, I have no idea what's in that man's mind, and I don't even want to go there. What I can say is the policies his administration has adopted are profoundly racialized policies that will produce racialized outcomes. Whether we intend for it to happen or not, or whether he intends for it to happen or not. And instead of focusing on trying to fix his mind, we should be focusing on fixing the policies and structures. So that's one of the shifts. And, you know, but the press wasn't interested in that. They wanted to know, is he a racist? That was the end of the story, beginning and the end of the story. Now, so that is not an unimportant story, whether someone is a racist or not, but it's a small piece of the story. We know from the work in mind science that only 2% of our cognitive and emotional processes are directly accessible to us consciously. 2%. Now in academia, there's a huge fight about this. Some people say it's not 2%, it's 3%. But no one believes that we have more than a small portion of our conscious mind direct access to what's going on unconsciously. So what is happening in the other 98%? And this is the part in terms of the mind science and implicit bias. And we actually can look through MRIs, we can test through online tests, speed tests, about what's actually happening in the unconscious. And what we know First of all, unconscious is complicated. It speaks a different language. It's not rational. And it affects our conscious decisions. So someone can actually be making a decision that's informed by race or class or age or gender, and honestly say, this has nothing to do with race. Because when they report that, they're telling you what they have access to. So they say, I looked in the 2% of my mind, and I didn't see any racial animus. So this has nothing to do with race. But the unconscious is like, that's what you think. This is all about race. And so I use the term that what we have in our unconscious, and being in a society where race is so important, that we have profound potential for racial anxiety. Now, the interesting thing about this is a social phenomenon. It's not just an individual. Society helps us develop what's happening in our unconscious. Our unconscious is, again, not completely private. If you go to society, again, where they're not organized around race, people won't have racial anxiety. So these are social phenomena. So part of the work then means getting beyond that 2%. And I know you can't read this because I can't. But we all know that it's difficult in this country to talk about race. Part of the reason is that we have a way of talking about race that's largely unproductive, that actually comes from the 1940s and 50s, or 1960s, when we had Bull Connor and people like that to actually beat up on around race. And so, again, when people talk about race, they immediately go to, are you suggesting that I'm a racist? Are you suggesting that all white people are racist? And if that's the case, I'm out of here. And so people feel guilty, people feel angry. They did a thing at Columbia where they talked to the students and after talking about race. And virtually all the white students felt guilty. Virtually all the students of color felt angry. And the white students felt guilty because it's like, well, maybe my great-grandparents had something to do with this, and maybe I have a little extra privilege hanging out at Columbia, but I don't want to feel that way. What can I do? I'm just an individual. And the blacks and Latinos and Asians were like, no one will talk to us. We have all this pain, we can't have a conversation. And we can't get the structures to change. So we have this unproductive conversation. Also, the language we have really developed out in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and the world has changed in some profound ways. And it hasn't necessarily changed in the way we think it's changed. We tend to think in binaries. So we think either we are stuck in the past, a la Reverend Wright, who still talks about race in the 1950s, or we're in a racial mecca called post-racialism. Now, of course, neither of those are true. We're not, as a society, stuck in the past. We are making progress of some sort on some levels, and we are slipping on others. And that seems like a contradiction. It seems like two ideas pushing in different directions, and we have a hard time with that. And not only do we have a hard time with it, we don't have a language for it. So how do we have a language that explains how you can have Oprah Winfrey, Obama, Colin Powell, I used to say Tiger Woods, but he had Woods. And at the same time have an explosion in the incarceration of African Americans. At the same time have Latinos dropping out of school all over the country. At the same time have Arizona adopting immigration laws and having people stand up and saying we should